Good morning, and welcome back. Are you ready for another tale of murder and mystery? I have risen rather earlier today in order to access the archives for our next tale. As we've shown, there have been many events in Greenwold over the years, most of them within the village itself and some within the wider Hazel Valley, but occasionally there have been mysteries that have crossed over the parish border. For today's tale, we go back to the 1960s. After the closure of two of the valley's train stations in the 1950s, it became much harder to travel in and out of the valley in any other way than by car. But people from the outside were more than ready to fill in the cultural void left, and the town, for a while, became quite a hotspot for touring theatre. Unfortunately, in 1965, the village attracted the attention of the Wet Weekend Travelling Theatre Company, whose minibus of 4 delusional thespians brought substandard drama with the side order of murder. So take a seat and enjoy. Everything you will hear today is taken verbatim from the accounts of the investigative journalist of the Hazel Valley Herald, Fern Forrest. Forrest became inexplicably entangled in the events of that summer. Whilst her eventual articles offer some information into the incidents, her diary entries are where the real story lies. We must assume, because I don't see why we wouldn't, what she writes here is the truth. Because what possible reason would she have to lie? Selected entry 1. Thursday, 10th of June, 1965. They're coming. I knew they would at some point. I heard from Petunia that they're currently touring, and it's been a couple of months since the last performance at Greenwold Village Hall. If I remember rightly, it was a rather awful improv troupe. They had one performer in particular who always wanted to be the main character, but whenever he went to speak would just entirely dry up. So we ended up watching an hour of long-form improv set at the United Nations surrounding a diplomat who couldn't string a sentence together. Which, as I write it, sounds like it could be funny. But don't worry, it wasn't. It was just boring. But I don't think the same will be said about the next performance. I've been keeping my eye on them for a while, checking in with colleagues and acquaintances from beyond the valley, and they all have the exact same story. As I remember it, the show itself is largely unmemorable. A quaint little murder mystery, 1 room, locked door, 3 suspects with motives but none with the opportunity. Then turns out the victim was shot after he'd already been poisoned with cyanide. All the suspects gathered for a big reveal. You know the story. I've seen a version of the show before, and it was bad. So if it wasn't for all the hullabaloo around it, I'd be steering well clear. But as it is, I simply couldn't miss it. You see, this touring theatre company, Wet Weekend their name is, have been performing this show at village halls up and down the country for the past 4 or 5 months. Standard rural touring venues in some more odd choices. Absolutely tiny places where they only managed to get 2 or 3 audience members. And it's in those places when it was ultimately noticed. They have confirmed through contacts at some of the bigger towns that the same thing happened in the larger performances too. I'm not too concerned. Greenwold Village Hall performances usually have around 20 in attendance. There is a tale of a political rally held there about a decade ago that had upwards of 25 people. If there's something that can be said about Greenwold, they do love their murders. So I feel like there'll be 20 there. Being one of 20 seems pretty decent odds. You see, Within 6 hours of every single performance of this show by Wet Weekend Travelling Theatre Company, one member of the audience is found in their homes, dead. No apparent relation to the show. No way their death could be linked back to the theatre company, but it is consistent. And I will find out how and why. I can only do that by attending this deadly show. Wet Weekend's touring remount of One of You Will Die. Also, at the Bexell this morning, Petunia's pastries were perfect. I really must remember to ask her where she got them from. End of diary entry 1. Selected diary entry 2. Monday, the 14th of June, 1965. I was able to use the paper's resources today to do a little bit of digging on the members of the troupe. And, after a little bit of calling around, I think I've got a good sense of the group. The man who runs the troupe, the leader, if indeed a theatre troupe has one, is Colin Cockles. He set up Wet Weekend after a semi-successful run of The Merry Wives of Windsor at the RSC. Feeling empowered by the faint whiff of success on his horizon, and the RSC making him realise that theatre could indeed exist outside of London, he set up Wet Weekend. Though, in an interview with a local paper from Dorset, Cockles did suggest that he only saw this company as being a stepping stone to him being artistic director of his words, proper theatre, which would then function as a stepping stone to him being artistic director of his words, proper London theatre, a real theatre. He's now been running Wet Weekend for 15 years. Over that decade and a half, he's been married 5 times, usually to one of his co-stars, and has directed and acted in every single one of Wet Weekend's shows. The female lead is Sylvia Starfish. She started out in performance art and did a particularly harrowing durational piece about the dangers of uneven steps. Having run through the majority of her father's fortunes on a series of public performances that the press called problematic, she's resorted to rural touring, and has been with Wet Weekend for the last 5 years. Hot on Starfish's ankles is the ingenue of the troupe, Clarissa Cockles, Colin Cockles' current cohabitor. Seemingly the only one who actually cares for rural theatre. She grew up in a small town, worked in a cigarette factory before 2 years ago, on her way to make it big in the big city, she was intercepted by Cockles' tour van and hasn't looked back. From all I can gather, it seems she truly does this for the love of theatre. And Colin has been starting to creep his newest wife into slightly more leading roles, much to the chagrin of Sylvia. Rounding out the actors is Leonard Limpet, who's been clinging on to Wet Weekend for the last decade. It's like anyone who listens, he's just doing this until he gets his big break. But every time the company's cast is announced, he's still there. By all accounts, Limpet and Cockles don't get along. But his career has thus far been saved by him being able to play a mediocrely passable young cad. Whether he'll be able to play the young love interest as he starts to inch into his 40s is anybody's guess. So that's all the actors, but, according to my sources, they also tour with a stage manager. But very little can be found out about them. They stay in the shadows, as stage managers are wont to do, can only really be seen when they are driving the van, mending the costume, putting up the set, focusing the lights, buying the consumables, operating the show, or any of their other responsibilities. If I were a more superstitious woman, I might wonder if the stage manager were a devil, like the one that apparently killed in Greenwold a decade ago, or so the village gossip said. But I'm not a superstitious woman, so I can only assume that the deaths associated with One of You Will Die are murder, plain and simple. And I will find that out for myself when they visit Greenwold Village Hall tomorrow. I also need to mention that Olive next door has got a new spaniel, and I can't for the life of me remember what it was called. I must work out a covert way of finding out that doesn't make it look like I wasn't paying attention. End of entry 2. Selected entry 3. Tuesday, the 15th of June, 1965. The show finished 40 minutes ago. I stayed for 20 to see if I could spot any foul play, but by that point their very officious stage manager had practically packed up and was driving off to the next venue. Not as many in there as I'd have liked, just 10 of us, which reduced it down to a 10% chance that I might be the victim. But 90 against isn't bad odds. Still no death yet. It would be surprising if it showed up quite so soon. The show itself was better than I feared. I was mistaken. I hadn't seen this one before, but it ran a fairly similar situation. When it started, and it wasn't what I recognised, I must admit I had a moment where I gave in to superstition. I've been reading The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, and in that book, The King in Yellow is in fact the name of a fictional play, a forbidden, suppressed book that ultimately makes madmen and murderers of all who read it. Chilling tale that sparked the unwelcome thought in my mind that maybe, just maybe, this play itself were a King in Yellow of sorts, and in watching it the audience might be driven to such madness that one of us might just die. But alas, the play might not have been terrible, but it wouldn't have caused that level of permanent impact, though poor Mr. Cardinal did find the admittedly shockingly gory finale rather too much for his weak stomach. He had to run off and throw up. And I could see a couple of the other old folks weighing up joining him. It was rather good fun. However, there were 4 events during the play that piqued my interest, and I'm sure that one of them must have been the cause of death, or a preliminary branding of the victim. Only time will tell which of the 4 actually caused the death, if indeed a death does happen. At the beginning of the play, Colin Cockles, as the boisterous Colonel Squid, bounded down the aisle of the audience seating and tripped over one of the uneven floorboards of the village hall, falling right into Mrs. Berry's lap. Should have seen her sour-puckered face. The incessant apologising that followed certainly suggested that it were accidental. What if it wasn't? Certainly a bold move, but if Mrs. Berry dies, I'd put money on that incident being intentional. The second standout moment was when Sylvia Starfish, playing the glamorous Lady Doversoul, was describing a torrid affair she'd been having and pointed to poor Mr. Flax, who was singled out as this fictional affair partner, a move which made him go bright red and after the performance receive an awful lot of flack from Mrs. Flax, who'd been sat right next to him. I'm not suggesting that any fatal chemical compound could have been consigned to Flax in that moment, but it certainly stood out amongst the moments of the play. It could very well have been Starfish assigning Mr. Flax, or even Mrs. Flax, as their victim. Midway through the second act, we were given little slips of paper by Clarissa Cockles in character as the maid, wearing her little white gloves and apron, and holding a tray with some glasses of water and said slips of paper on it. As she handed them out, we were to write then on them who we thought the murderer was. Very interesting. Now, she was already playing quite nervous at this point, quite understandably, as in the world of the play the young inspector had just arrived. But as she was handing out the slips, Letitia Lilac stood up, causing the tray to topple and one of the glasses of water to tip over. Cockles handed the remaining slips of paper out by hand, though they were rather sodden. Whilst the mistake was definitely caused by Letitia's standing, certainly, it may put a target on her back. And finally, just before the final scene, where Leonard Limpet, as the inspector, is beheaded in a rather impressive, grotesque stage effect, beheaded by the maid and served to Colonel Squid and Lady Doversoul, one of Limpet's blood bags popped too early. We had a brief show stop as Limpet made his way to the stage manager at the back of the audience to replace it with a new blood bag. It had rather spoiled the twist and the surprise, but as Limpet made his way to the back of the audience, he put his hand on Mr. White's shoulder, leaving a bloody handprint on his white shirt, most on-the-nose identifying the victim, if indeed that was what it was. But indeed, it may be what it was. I believe only time will tell. And which of the victims die will identify the murderer. I feel sure that if Mrs. Berry dies, it is Colin Cockles. If Mr. or Mrs. Flax dies, it is down to Sylvia Starfish. If Letitia Lilac kicks the bucket tonight, it's Clarissa Cockles. And if this is Mr. White's last night, I blame Leonard Limpet. It is, of course, possible that I may be killed, though I do hope not. But I will write my review of the performance tonight, so that Hazel Valley Herald may still print it, just in case. End of entry 3. Selected entry 4, Wednesday, 16th of June, 1965. Mr. Cardinal died last night. After vomiting more when he got home, he was struck by a bout of diarrhea before slipping into a coma and dying. He was fairly old and frail, so I don't imagine anyone will even ask for a post-mortem. But I will, because I know how he died, and I know who did it. Just need to find out why. Something I intend to do tomorrow. I am going to intercept the Wet Weekend Theatre group at their next performance, and I intend to confront them. Also, I bumped into Olive and her dog again today. Still can't remember the little thing's name for the life of me. Tried a couple of methods of finding it out, but Olive seemed to remain oblivious. End of entry 4. And that, I'm afraid, is the end of Fern Forrest diary entries altogether. She never did find out that Olive's dog's name was Ishmael, nor did she ever return to her house again. But fear not, this is not the end of Forrest's story. We have one more item in the archive, dated 2 years after the Greenwold performance. A letter from Forrest to Leonard Limpet. I shall read it now. My dear Leonard, I hope you are well, and I am so proud of you for finally achieving your big break. I have news. I've been cast as the young male cat in the next Wet Weekend rural tour, so I suppose I shall stay on. Limpet by name, Limpet by nature, my dear. Who would have thought, when I came to watch that show and then came to confront Clarissa about her poisoning our audiences, that I would come to become a permanent Wet Weekender myself. And to think, I started out as a reporter. Speaking of Clarissa, I'm afraid to tell you she's died. Nicotine poisoning. It's hardly surprising given the amount of liquid nicotine she's handled over the years. I always found her routine rather funny. She'd pretend to wobble the tray, knocking the water over the slips of paper, and then hand out the sodden pieces to the rest of the audience, choosing one of the weakest audience members to hand the slip to that was not wet with water, but wet with liquid nicotine. Thank Dionysus she always wore gloves. But then again, she knew all about nicotine poisoning when she used to work in the cigarette factory. But anyway, she's dead now, so Colin had to go and find a new wife to go and do Dionysus' bidding. Oh, and his new wife is gorgeous. You would love her. Like me, at first she called us a cult of murderers, but we showed her the way. Colin's very good at that. Now she sees that we have to kill every few days in order to keep Dionysus happy. You'd be so proud of me. After Clarissa's death, even I had to do a few of the sacrifices. You won't guess how I did them. I wish I could come and see you on stage, Leonard. I've no doubt you are the star you were always meant to be. Both yours and Dionysus's always, your loving wife, Fern Limpet. So there it is. I can only imagine the kind of brainwashing that must have gone on in the wet weekend cult. Some say that they made their new recruits read a play, some forbidden, suppressed book that makes madmen and murderers of all who read it. That seems rather far-fetched. I will leave us now with the review of One of You Will Die that Fern Forrest sent her editor at the Hazel Valley Herald the night before she became the latest wet weekender. One of You Will Die. 4 stars. Well performed, despite a few mess-ups. Design and technical elements were simple yet effective. Shame the show is surrounded by the stench of death. And there it is. Short, concise, and surprisingly positive. Gives you a lot to think about, doesn't it? Doesn't it indeed? Well, good day.